Welcome to Eternal Elements Learning Podcast, brought to you by Tiasa Online. These podcasts are a part of the audio certificate programs on Tiasa Online. You're free to take these podcasts on your desired portal also, should you only wish to learn on the go. Thank you so much for engaging on these podcasts, and you can connect with the author on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Welcome back. This is Niket Karajagi from Eternal Elements, brought to you by Tiasa Online. We're discussing strategy, and we're actually discussing grand strategies. We talk about a ninth grand strategy of turnaround. In my earlier podcast, I spoke about strategies which are good for expansion, which is good for growth. However, a lot of times organizations do run into rough weather. First, it's important to understand, why do organizations get into rough weather? Why does the turbulence set in? Primarily, as a consultant, I have noticed the behaviors of the leaders don't change. What brought them success in the past is what they believe will get them the success all over again in the future. But that doesn't work, because your turnover is based on specific behaviors, and these are the collective behaviors of the organization. So number one, behaviors get into trouble. Second, a lot of inefficiencies start setting into the organization, because as the organization grows, there are redundant processes, and those processes are actually not value adding to the business. Nobody is doing audit of processes, and therefore the organization is no longer lean in their processes. Too many processes, too many inefficiencies choke up the whole system. Over a period of time, we lose control on our assets also. We forget that every asset must give a return on investment. We stop calculating that. We stop controlling our strategies. A lot of time, turnaround is required because lethargy sets into the system. The willingness to deliver performance starts deteriorating. A lot of times, people start operating as a group which has no goals. They're no longer teams, they're just groups with individual goals. And a lot of times, a lot of agency problems sets into the organization where there is no congruence with the goals of the organization. So there are many reasons why organizations really take a downturn. In my corporate life, I was involved mostly with startups or with turnaround operations in large organizations. And I love the process of turnaround because there's so much to learn. So what is a turnaround strategy? It's a grand strategy where either you reduce your assets, both tangible and intangible, or costs, and the aim is to recover from the declining profits. Because unless and until you have money in your coffers, you cannot run an organization. Deep pockets are essential for building great organizations. So in a turnaround strategy, you typically do two things. First one, you start off with reduction of cost. That means you enter into a phase where you decide that you're now going to cut cost. And therefore, you start auditing everything within the organization. And wherever there is a waste, you start cutting it. Because whether it is a waste associated with processes, systems, effort, or uncontrolled expenses, you start cutting them. The second part is you start controlling and cutting your assets. You only preserve those productive assets which are essential to run the business. The rest of the assets, you dispose them off. Retrenchment is also a part of the turnaround strategy, where people with high willingness and high talent are the ones who are retained, and the rest of the people are just led away. You downsize the company, you give them golden handshakes. A turnaround strategy typically operates in two phases. One, you're scaling down the company in terms of its assets and in terms of its costs. The second phase is when you start recovering. Therefore, there is a recovery phase in the turnaround. Once the retrenchment is done, once you cut down on your costs and your assets, the company starts limping back to normal. I strongly recommend the use of design thinking, which talks about a simple idea. Go for the low-hanging fruits. Take the goals of recovery which are easily achievable. Don't set lofty goals. And step by step, baby steps, turn the company around. That's what I've done in my corporate life. In my own company, now that I'm an entrepreneur, there are a lot of times when you have to turn around the organization because the environment around you changes and the same strategy works there too. Retrenchment should be the last option that the company should exercise because you've developed your people over a period of time and it's not a great idea to let them go. Once the recovery phase starts, then again you use design thinking because as you recover, the recovery can be U-shaped. But if you do want to have a V-shaped recovery, the best way is design thinking because what happens is as you achieve small goals, suddenly they start having a cascading effect or a domino effect, and because of that the recovery starts becoming extremely fast. That's the turnaround strategy. It is a fascinating strategy because there's so much to learn. We live in a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. There will be scenarios where you'll have to constantly turn around your operations because what worked in the past is not going to work in the future. In the next podcast, I will start talking about scenarios where it is impossible to turn the organization around. When does that happen? A lot of times it happens when either the company is completely bled of its resources or the market is not growing at all. Turnaround is good as long as the market is doing fine. But if the market is not doing fine and your company is primarily holding outdated technology and outdated product, at that point in time, turnaround is possible if you venture into a domain which is more based on technology. But if you don't wish to do that, that's when the next strategy comes into action, which is called the divestiture. It's all about divesting the company. So the strategy of divestiture is what we're going to talk about in our next podcast. Thank you very much. This is Niket Karajagi from Eternal Elements signing off, and I shall see you in the strategy number 10 in my next podcast.